Hey there, Cassandra here, the Vintage Arcade Gal, and it's been a hot minute since I have made one of these videos, but I've been pretty busy with school, but that has not stopped my conquest of trying to fit as many arcade games in a small suburban house as possible. We have a new game, which surprised really no one who's ever read my blog or watched one of these videos, but what's interesting is this particular game is historically interesting, and definitely not the normal kind of game I probably would collect, and not a game I ever thought I'd own. So let's go downstairs to the workshop and take a look at it. So here it's a Pong, obviously. Pong gets kind of the incorrect title of being the first video arcade game ever made. It's actually the second after Computer Space, which was also had development with Nolan Bushnell, who was one of the founders of Atari, but Pong was actually programmed by a guy named Al Alcorn. But you can see on our Pong, it's signed by Mr. Bushnell. He's kind of like the Stanley of Atari. He just kind of takes ownership of everything, I guess. But really, really psyched to have this. Originally, the gentleman who sold this to us has his own Pong, and he was the caretaker of what I would call 3 Pong shells in various parts in boxes. So originally I was going to buy all 3, but that didn't quite happen. So we ended up with 1, and they were all in about the same kind of condition and quality, and we had to build it up and repair it, and nothing was working, neither the monitor or the PCB or anything. We'll show a little bit more in a second. But the interesting thing about Pong, if you've never seen one, is one, it's extraordinarily simple. It begins Atari's love affair with wood grain, which is kind of fun. And the cabinet itself is not very large. In fact, if we look right next to it at the Donkey Kong, and I'm going to kind of scoot this over. Now, the Donkey Kong machine, which is not a very big machine either, it's at least 8 to 10 inches shorter, and these things are on rollers, so they're even taller than they should be. And it doesn't go very far back. It's a pretty small cabinet. You can almost say that Pong is a cabaret more than an upright. There were a couple variations of the real deal Atari Pong machines over the process of manufacturing. The font on the control panel changes. The knobs sometimes change. These are not the original knobs. The knobs are often missing. They become pretty loose pretty easily, so I'm sure they got stolen back in the day. And there's some debate about which knobs are the real knobs, but I found these 3D printed reproduction knobs that were really intended for stereos from the 70s, but they look pretty good. They're pretty close to some of the Pong knobs I've seen. And down here on the bottom of the cabinet, it kind of has this dramatical cut angle on the very base, and eventually they changed this and got rid of it. It just goes flush front like a regular cabinet. The problem with this is it easily tips over to the front. We found out that the hard reaction when we loaded it, which is probably only the second time I've ever been involved with dropping an arcade game in my 25 years of collecting, but this is definitely not one you want to drop, because finding a Pong today is pretty rare, and they made probably around 7,000 to 9,000 of these machines back in the day. But Atari was a new company, so they didn't really have the production capacity to make as many as probably would have the market would have wanted. Plus, there were so many bootlegs and so many copies of Pong, it probably really ate into Atari's market. There's also this weird thing with distributors back in the early part of video games and electromechanical games where they were very brand-centric, so not every company could necessarily sell in every region. It was kind of strange, which is why in the 70s you see there's a company called Key Games, which is just Atari under a new name, so they could kind of circumvent some of that weird distribution kind of issues and loyalties that were around. It's all kind of strange. I don't really understand all of it. But let's take a look inside the Pong, because I think a lot of people have never actually seen in a Pong. So let's take a look at it. So on the top, you have the serial number. Sometimes this is missing, and it's interesting because how they did these serial numbers, a letter designation and a number designation, but they started with ZZZZ and then did the number, and then the next batch were AAA, then they would go back to YYY and sort of. My understanding is they skipped a lot of numbers, so it's really impossible to fully understand how many they made or kind of the order of them truly. But we get an idea from the serial number. This is probably somewhere in the middle part of the production. All the monitors and Atari Pongs are just off-the-shelf 12-inch televisions. Just like if you went into a Sears in 1972, decided to buy a small black and white television for yourself, it's exactly the same thing. And they aren't necessarily brand loyal. It's whatever Atari could get a hold of, but it seems like a majority of them are either Toshiba or Mitsubishi models of that era. Now, it connects strangely, and this was very confusing, and I couldn't find any information online about this, but I'm going to go over that after we kind of look through this, and I'll show you how to hook a regular television, because it seems like one of the big sour points. A lot of people have these, but the TVs have died, and they don't know how to hook up to a TV, but I'll show you how. Now, as archaic as it is, how this works is that there's just these two kind of eyelet big bolts on either side, and it was strapped down by this kind of rope. This is almost like rope you would find almost like at a basketball net. So I was a little nervous about using 50-year-old twine to hold this together, so I got this little baby ratchet strap, and it's in there. And then the bezel in the front is just cardboard. This is not the original one. As you can imagine, most of those are deteriorated, but some later versions had a hard plastic bezel, and those seem to have survived the elements a little bit better than the cardboard ones for obvious reasons. So as we go down, we're just going to go in, and there's not much in this thing compared to a lot of other arcade games. Modern arcade games, you see the pots for the two paddles up here, and the single coin mech. Now, some later ones did have a coin door that opened up from the front, a lot like Midway coin doors, but this is an earlier model, so this was kind of a pain in the neck. There's a little slam switch back here that will turn the game off if it's bumped too harshly. Look here. This is just the coin holder, and it's just a little loaf pan like you could buy at a grocery store in the 70s. It's exactly what it is. It's just you can make your pound cake. I've got a little isolation transformer and just one single fuse that goes into the harness. Now, normally the monitor would also be spliced and connected directly to the isolation transformer, but I've elected to plug it in separately just for future endeavors. And this is our PCB. It's just a single board, and there's a couple variations of this board. Some have this big, huge capacitor laying flush with the board. This is an earlier one that has it sticking out. And there's some hints and tips to get these things working. I've put on my blog if you're interested or have a diagnosis issue. I had to replace 3 ICs and a couple of the smaller capacitors to get this up and going. Then we have our counter, which says it says 15,206. Who knows if that got flipped over, if that's realistic. Pong was very, very popular back in the day, and Atari loved the wood grain so much it's even wood grain inside. So, and like most arcade games, it was missing the back door, but we've recreated a new back door for it. So let's take a look. I'll show you how the TV actually hooks up to this thing. So this poor old bastard is the original TV that looks like it's been through a war that was in our Pong machine. Unfortunately, it was beyond repair. I don't think it's too difficult to see why. It's lived a long and terrible life. But I wanted to show, this is a great teaching tool to show you how to hook any 12-inch TV. So if you have a Pong machine and it's not working, get yourself just an old 12-inch black and white television from this era. You can find these for $40, $50, $60 all day long. I found the one that's in our Pong machine right now is an old new stock Toshiba, which is exactly the same model as this, just like a couple years newer. This is a 1973 version. The one in there, I think, is a 1975. So it's almost exactly the same model. And you can see they ripped off the knob, but they left the volume control and the UHF knob because this doesn't really do anything for that. So, anywho, let's take a look. And of course, you want to do this if you're comfortable with television repair. So, you know, I always tell people messing with this stuff can kill you if you don't know what you're doing. So be careful. I'm not responsible if you screw up your life or your body or anything else. But if you take off the back panel of the television, what you see, this was the connectors for VHF and UHF, and this is what you're going to connect the three things that go from the control panel. Now, with most other arcade games like JAMA games or whatever, you usually have the sound input that goes to a separate speaker or amplifier or what have you, but there's usually a red, green, blue connector all separate, a ground, and a sync. With Pong and a lot of these early black and white games, it's just video, sound, and ground, and that's it. But you can't just connect them to the antenna. You're just going to get a lot of interference. It doesn't understand that. And like the old Atari 2600 little switch boxes, those don't work either. You have to directly connect it. So what you do is these connectors will become the inputs for your ground, your video, and your sound. So if you have a Virgin television from this era, what you're going to do is take this apart and clip the lead, because the VHF sequence is going to have a bridge connector for this, and you don't want that anymore, so you're going to get rid of that. And you see this has been a ground splice here. It's been soldered on the back, and then they just soldered it to this metal plate down here. You had to get it to something that's metal, and you don't want it to be right on the chassis, so that was a good spot for it. And then you would connect your ground from the PCB right to there. And this one, the next one, what they did, they wired that for the video. So you connect your video from the PCB here, and then here, this is probably going to be really hard to see, but there's a test point, a video test point, and sometimes these are listed as TIP 1, 2, or 3, and you're going to have to check the manual or maybe do some exploring. Be careful. And that directly connects the video feed to the actual tube and chassis. So it disregards the tuner from this point. But you notice the tuner is actually mostly still here. And then third, the sound. So you insert your sound from the PCB into there, and then you're going to wire from that connector to, and it's kind of hard to see on this one, but you're going to the volume switch input, so that way the incredible soundtrack of Pong can be heard, and you can still use your volume knob to adjust if you want it super loud or super soft, although it's pretty volume-rific just as a default. You have to be careful though, because a lot of volume knobs on these little TVs also are the functionality or dual functionality and deal with the power. So make sure you do the right one and not the power, or you're going to have a bad time. You may cause some minimum feedback. At worst, you may end up frying your Pong board because of voltage issues. So be very, very cautious. One other thing to keep in mind, a lot of people get confused about Pong because it will justify the picture somewhat to the left, and you can adjust it a little on the TV, but that's by default. For some reason, all Pongs are slightly justified to the left. And now that you've seen that with this TV is going to recycling. So thanks for 50 years of service, little Toshiba television. So if you're one of like the 3 people in the universe my age who has never played Pong, or who were born like well after Pong came out, and you've never really seen it in action, it's a pretty simple game where you just have 2 paddles on either side of the net, and you try not to miss, and it will bounce off the top and the bottom of the screen. The little dash in the middle is really just an ornamentation. It doesn't really do much of anything. And that is where the serve ball comes out. It's about as basic as you can imagine. This was not really the first video tennis style game though. The magic of Pong was that earlier games, such as the ones developed for Magnavox, for the Odyssey, or even things that engineers would do on oscilloscopes, is that depending upon where the ball hits on the paddle determines the angle of it leaving the paddle. So it makes a little more strategy to it rather than just constantly hitting back and forth. And it's designed to be a two-player game. So that's a pretty clever thing because it became an instant social interaction, especially if it's 1972 or so and you're trying to pick somebody up in a bar. It's like, hey, baby, want to play some Pong? So you got your quarter, you just stick it in, and it starts the game. And you just it's kind of lame to play it by yourself, but try to get a good volley here. You see what bounce. You can go straight or you can angle it. And the longer the little volleys go on, the faster the ball will get. There are 3 variable speeds. And then there's, see now it's at the fastest. So it's kind of looking. And the first player to 11 wins, or 15 depending upon what the switch is set on. And it just beeps. There's really just the low tone, the mid tone, and the high tone beep. Those are the only sound effects. But this was the second video arcade game of all time, and the first majorly successful one. And I think Pong, you could definitely make the argument that this is probably the most important video arcade game ever made, because even though Computer Space became before it, technically the game was a flop. It didn't do well because it was too complicated for the common man or woman to really understand and just jump into. Compared to Pong, where anyone can understand how to play this, pick it up instantly, very easy to learn, which was kind of Atari's philosophy. Easy to learn, but difficult to master. And I don't think there's a lot of them left around anymore, because when Space Invaders came out, these things were beyond archaic, and there were so many clones of Pong, I think they just got thrown away, because it was really before the era of conversion kits or changing games or modifying them, although there was a mod kit called Gyro Pong for this, which is kind of interesting. But it just became old hat, and this cabinet is so interesting and unique. I don't know what you would possibly convert this into, plus it's too small for anything other than a 12-inch tiny monitor. So there you go, a Pong, a surviving Pong. Super excited to have this in the collection, obviously, of historic value for sure. I never thought I'd own a Pong. I just always thought it would be well out of the realm of collecting to have one, especially one running on all original hardware. It's just a special treat. And a true survivor, we didn't really do a lot to it physically other than fix some bumps and bruises in the cabinet. There's a little bit of water damage on it, but nothing significant. It was mostly all mechanical inside that we had to do. So Pong, there you go. So that's all I really have for you right now. I have been actually working on getting better at board repair, and I think I'll make a video that in the future when I have a little bit more to talk about. But we've actually been able to fix a number of boards, which has been kind of surprising, to be honest with you. And there's a couple of other projects that we have in the works, but we can't really do much with them because they require paint and a lot of hardware until the weather warms up. It's been pretty cold up here in Seattle. We've had a pretty eventful winter, especially the last couple of weeks. So until then, I'll see you. Happy hunting, happy collecting, and be safe out there.